All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues joining from across Africa and any other place you're joining from. Welcome to the 5th edition of the ASFI Science Seminar Series 2022. We are delighted to have you to join us this evening. So we invite you, please sit tight and play your role to contribute your quota to this evening's discussion, which we believe will be engaging and eye-opener as usual. So welcome to you all. As we do, please use the chat box to introduce yourselves, tell us where you're coming from, and of course, beyond the seminar series we have this evening's is a place to get connected, to find common interests across the continent. So please make use of the chat box to introduce yourself and go on with the conversation. All right, so this evening we'll be moving to the field of archaeology. As you know, we started this year promising you to bring on board speakers from different areas of scientific research to give us highlights what is happening in their field and how this advancement in research in different fields is contributing to the development of our continent, Africa. And that is why the theme for this year is spotlighting research, advancing Africa's development. So archaeology we go today, and as you can see on the screen, we'll be dealing with issues of heritage, knowledge appropriation, science and technology. As usual, my name is Bright Waro, and I am the convener of this forum. And I have my co-convener, Eman Sob. So Eman, please, can you say some words before we move on?
Welcome everyone to this edition of ASFI Research Seminar, Science Seminar Series. We welcome you to participate actively in this fruitful discussion. Please engage, collaborate, and be an active participant. We welcome our extraordinary presenter, Prof. Alinah, and the moderator, Ulabisi. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Eman. Thank you. All right. Yes. So as Eman mentioned, the speaker will be Prof. Alinah Segobye, and the moderator is Dr. Olabisi Dedeke. Prof. Alinah is a friend of the house. She's not new to this forum. She has spoken to us last year on the topic of scientific research and the role of government in this area. So please, she'll be appropriately introduced at the right time. All right, for those who are just joining us, we go through these few slides to tell you about the ASFI. And as you can see here, we have our vision, and that is to raise the next generation of African scientists who have the right competencies to drive Africa's developmental and transformation agenda through innovative scientific research. And this is quite important. If you have followed our activities, it's very important. We try to motivate you that scientists in Africa for a long time will have been on the passenger seat. We want you to go to the driver's seat, because that is where our contributions are needed to support the development of our continent. Our continent is in a sorry state, and we believe that scientists in our continent have a very critical role to play through the research we do and how this can be implemented to advance our development. So our mission is to instill excellence. We want to contribute to African science that actually focuses on tackling Africa's development. For it is only a competent science that can help to change our current narrative. So in doing this, we organize forums like these, seminars and workshops, forums that we continue to provide a platform for these conversations to be active, so that we can be continuously conscious when we do our research, that our research should focus on innovating strategies that can help our continent to improve. We also have hands-on courses in different areas, scientific research methods, capacity building and career development, science leadership, science communication. And I believe that a lot of you who are here this evening have been candidates of some of these activities. We also have a robust mentoring program that is very active, different cohorts of mentees we have, bringing on board both old and young African scientists supporting one another. And the goal is through these processes, we can all develop to world-class scientific leaders in the continent. We also have ongoing research activities, trying to produce surveys that can help us to know how different research issues are developing in the continent. ASFI started exactly 2 years ago. And during this period, we have had 7 5-day courses we have organized. We have had huge applications, as you can see on the screen, and we have trained 817 participants and counting. And we have done this from over 40 countries. People have participated in our courses. This is quite impressive during this period, and it has been quite fantastic to be able to interact and to have African scientists who are hungry to improve their career ambition, improve their capacity in a way that can do their job properly. So we have had, as you see, over 3,000 applicants, able to train only 817. We can't train everybody, and so that is why we are so selective when we get people. The goal is that we can train people who will be able to go back to their various areas and replicate these things and support their colleagues as well. So this is very important, and so that when you get rejection, please don't take it personal. Don't take it personal. We try to do our best to select in order that we can have representation gender-wise, career-wise, country-wise, and so on, different professional levels. So we do our best, and I hope that you understand if you have not been able to participate in any of these activities. But we have an ongoing application to the systematic reviews and meta-analysis. For those who have not participated this period, we are going to ensure we have new faces. Those who have not taken part in our courses this far, we will try to give them space to also see what we are doing. And so we have also throughout last year had a science seminar series. Last year, we focused on topics related to career development and capacity building. This year, as I said earlier, we are shifting direction to bring on board different research areas, different disciplines to tell us what developments are happening in their different areas. In addition to that, this year we introduced Dr. Warren's research tips and tricks. Some of you have been coming, and we are happy that the turnout has been impressive. Last Friday, we looked at growing your research team, which is a very critical aspect of really doing good research. How to select your research team, how to develop your research culture, how to grow as a team, and how to, of course, pursue the ultimate goal of doing research, and that is to impact positively the society. So African society needs positive impact from researchers. And we had the 50th edition on Friday, and we'll continue next month to the 60th edition. So please continue to join us. All right, let me go straight to introduce the moderator for this evening, who will be introducing the speaker. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Olabisi Iyabode Dedeke. She has been a regular participant in our programs, quite supportive. She's currently a chief consultant pediatrician at the Federal Medical Center in Abeokuta, Ogun State in Nigeria. She is a co-investigator in the World Health Organization Action Trial. And she has a medical degree from Olabisi Onabanjo University in Nigeria, an MPH from Obafemi Awolowo University, also in Nigeria, and recently Master of Science in Neonatology from the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. She's a fellow of several professional organizations, but to point out, as a result of space, she is a fellow of the West African College of Physicians and the pediatric section. She is the president of the Medical Women Association of Nigeria, Ogun State chapter. She has published widely, and we are delighted to have her moderate this session this evening. As just a housekeeping, as you entered, we have muted everyone, and that is because these sessions are recorded, and so we want to have seamless recording, and so that those who are not able to join can listen afterward. So please, if it's time, if you have time that you want to speak, just to use the raise hand button and you'll be recognized, and we can ask you to unmute yourself. And so as the topic is going on, the presenter is making her presentation. Please, as usual, use the chat box to ask your questions, make your contribution, and we'll be taking note of that at our end here, collecting those feedback. So initially I said, use the chat box as well, introduce yourself. This is a forum, not just to listen, but to contribute, to collaborate, to network, to introduce new faces. And we have had good testimonials, people connecting from these forums and continuing collaboration afterward. So please make use of that. And I'm happy to introduce Dr. Olabisi Dedeke. Olabisi, is over to you. Can you unmute, or do you want me to? You can't unmute it. Okay. Just a minute. Now you can unmute.
Thank you very much, Bright. Thank you, everybody. I welcome everybody to this call, and to say that I have the privilege today to introduce to you Alinah Segobye, an extraordinary professor at the Northwest University and research scholar at the African Future Institute in South Africa. She's the former Dean of Faculty, Human Sciences at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. She's a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. She serves on the African Union Commission's Champion for Arts, Culture, and Heritage panel of experts. Alinah has teaching, research, and consultancy experience in African studies, including archaeology, culture, and heritage management, HIV and AIDS, gender and development. And Alinah had authored several essays and book chapters on Africa's development. Of note, she is a leader and a coach for Superior Results Professional Development course at the Gordon Institute of Business Sciences in South Africa, and also part of the Nexus Leadership Program, Professional Development course also at the Gordon Institute of Business Sciences in South Africa. She has received so many recognition and awards. And apart from being an extraordinary professor at the Northwest University in recent years, she's an honorary associate professor at the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute, UNASA, Pretoria, South Africa. Also an associate senior researcher at the Tiswani University of Technology, Pretoria. She has had different outstanding research management and academic leadership experience. Of note is the fact that she's a member of boards and international committees in different organizations. And up to date, she's part of the Brand Africa Academy, a member of the African Union Champions Task Force Group on Art, Culture, and Heritage. She's also a member of the African Union Champions Task Force Group on Art, Culture, and Heritage. She's in the membership of editorial boards of different journals, to include the Nawa Journal in Namibia, the Cambridge University Press Series African Identity, Past and Present. She's also in the editorial boards of the Pan-African University Press, the Zimbabwe, the South African Archaeological Bulletin. She's a membership of professional and learned associations, including the SARIMA, International Age Society, Society for Africanist Archaeologists, SAFA, Association of Professional Archaeologists of Southern Africa, ASAPA. She had several technical and leadership experience. I would like you all to get set today to listen to her as she speaks on archaeology and Africa's development, heritage, knowledge, appropriation, science, and technology. As we all know, archaeology is the study of human history and prehistory through excavation of sites and analysis of artifacts and other physical remains. But we particularly know that archaeology is important, especially in Africa, because it shows how the Africans has adapted to his or her environment over the millennium. In other words, there are different changes in life, climate, and other conditions that has been documented. And we need to know how Africans has adapted to these changes over the year. We know that Africa has the longest record of human habitation in the world. The first hominids emerged about 6 to 7 million years ago. And among these, people have discovered modern human skulls that were discovered by Homo Kibish, Jebel, and Florisba. I'd like you to write your questions in the chat box, which we will collate and present to the speaker at the end of this talk. I want you to sit tight because I have no other person with me but an erudite scholar in the call to do justice to this topic and give quality to the time we'll be spending on this call. Welcome with me today, no other person than the extraordinary professor of archaeology, Professor Alinah Segobye. You're welcome, madam.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Thank you very much, the conveners of this very important seminar series and the other trainings that you organize. I really appreciate your invitation. I especially appreciate your introduction, Dr. Dedeke, because we all sometimes forget how important it is that we are sometimes introduced and brought to the forefront of others who may not know us on a day-to-day basis. So I really appreciate that. Colleagues, good evening, good morning, and good day from wherever you may be. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak about the field I'm passionate about, as the topic indicates, I'm going to speak to you about a field that is my profession, archaeology. But I'm doing so in the context of how archaeology interfaces with the idea of Africa's development. And in this regard, as has been said in my introduction, I tend to work currently in the area that traverses the past, the present, and the future. And I'm very keen to bring in this discussion, this idea that to appreciate Africa's current present moment, it's very important to understand our very deep and complex pasts, but also to go beyond that and explore together how we can shape Africa's futures. I work in the spaces today of the past, the present, and the future, because I believe that's the only way in which we can begin to unravel in many ways how Africa as a continent and African people can contribute to this very issue of development, science, and technology. Without much delay, let me just share with you a few slides. I've tried to keep it very simple, just so that it's not too wordy, among other things, in terms of presentation. So I'll hope that we'll have an interactive session. But I just want to share a few slides and speak to them in the context of my field. And you'll forgive me if I become very, I'd say, introspective in my presentation, because oftentimes I find that appreciation of African archaeologists is something that we take for granted as professionals, archaeologists, but oftentimes it's something that perhaps is not always so obvious to those who are not in the practice of the discipline of archaeology. So I'll just share my screen quickly and hope that I can okay. So I hope the screen sharing has started.
Yes.
Yes. And with that, I can go to slideshow and just perhaps we go to the first one. Yeah, so I wanted to speak today to this topic of archaeology in Africa's development, the subject matter being the issue of heritage and the or you could say related topic of how knowledge is produced and how and why perhaps Africa's knowledge was appropriated and by whom, and what is the future in this regard of our owning the science and technology that comes with our current and future systems. And in this, I will just introduce a few topics that may be of interest. And that is why, as I said earlier, it's important to, in the context setting, to speak about Africa's archaeologists, because there's not one set of archaeological knowledge, but there's a whole complex discourse around Africa's knowledge production and also the production of the past. In terms of discourse of the African continent's development trajectories, many of us are familiar with the global narratives that have been shaping our continent, namely the idea that Africa is a continent without history, a continent that is incapable of producing past and current, contemporary, and future possibly knowledge systems and development trajectories that are meaningful or impactful. And this, of course, has been challenged in many regards by other scholars, especially those who are working in the field of development, who have highlighted how these narratives are obviously produced in most cases to, if not exclude, but to hide Africa's rich contribution to development. And through my presentation, I want to highlight where and how this has happened. And in this regard, the practice of archaeology on the continent, especially how we've come to understand and appreciate African archaeology, has also been, in this regard, a narrative that has been rewritten in many ways, especially where other scholars, past and contemporary, have continued to oftentimes silence, as we call it, or hide the contributions of the continent and of African archaeologists to the discipline of archaeology. And this is where we as practitioners have come in to highlight the importance of recognizing the contribution of African archaeologists, anthropologists, and other practitioners to the global science that we call archaeology. Now, in terms of the histories of archaeology in this regard, my presentation looks at how, through the process of colonization of the continent of Africa, We've seen the exclusion of Africa from the very discourses that shaped the idea of Africa's visibility in the global stage. In this regard, imperial or colonial governments have in the past and in contemporary times continued to possess and appropriate African knowledge systems, African material culture, and in many regards, African cultural heritage in ways that undermine the capacity of the continent to manage, utilize, and even, you could say, harness in terms of a very futuristic way its own heritage. And this is where some of us believe the past matters. Even though the teaching of history of the past and of all forms of archaeologies have been excluded or gradually been taken away from curricula across the continent, and even in other countries where African studies is receiving less support, we believe that the past matters because only once we begin to appreciate the importance of our own histories, especially science and technology, can the continent begin to reclaim its knowledge and space in terms of repositioning science and technology know-how in a globalizing world. And in this regard, some of us also believe this is important if we are to ensure that African citizenry, both on the continent and the diaspora, can reclaim their own personhood, what we call in the global south, Ubuntu Obotu. Because without a proper appreciation of your own roots, knowledge, and identities, it's very difficult to position yourself as a global player. And that is why oftentimes this idea that we can go and harness other forms of science and knowledge elsewhere are remiss if we consider the importance of, among other things, people being rooted in their own cultural context, including language, including where they identify as our own spaces of origin. And in this regard, many of you may be familiar with some of the current, you could say, contradictions in the appreciation of science, where the African continent is oftentimes posited as a continent without a past. And yet we know that from the very global south of the Cape, all the way to the global, or to the north in terms of the northern part of the continent, Africa is resplendent with remnants of its rich heritage and rich past, including, as has been said by Madam Moderator, the discoveries that have been made of paleontological remains that indicate the origins of modern humankind on the African continent. I won't go into great details in that, but I'll also highlight how that is important in shaping how we understand and appreciate science and technology. In concluding, I'll highlight how the idea of science, technology, and innovation, STEM sciences, is critical if we are to break down some of these myths or narratives that have been built around Africa in terms of appreciating how and why we need to understand quite deeply what we sometimes call the long history of the continent, including the long history of technology and innovation, and its significance in shaping current and future discourses around critical issues such as health, human security, among other things, and our relationship with nature. In this case, our ecosystemic knowledge of the environment, including, of course, in this regard, what the continent has been known for: very rich mineral deposits, very rich natural resources that are currently being exploited for commercial purposes, but oftentimes at the detriment of the development of the citizenry of the continent. So what has been the key issue in terms of Africa's narratives around history? Many will be familiar with the fact that the African continent over the last, if we take the last 500-year trajectory, has been a history that has been seen as devoid of history, but is also in contradiction, a continent that has been plundered initially for its human resources in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, and then its natural resources in terms of the extractive economies, whether it is of natural mineral deposits or even natural products such as wood in this instance, forestries that have been logged, or natural products including plant foods and others. So why is it important that we need to be reframing our histories as a continent? It's important because currently, when you look at the global media space, in the last 40 or so years, the continent has been presented as a continent of challenges, whether it is human scarcity in terms of resources, knowledge capital, or environmental deficit in terms of its problems that have been associated with famines or droughts, or even conflicts. So we need to be reshaping these narratives that have framed the continent as a continent that is plagued by problems, and look at it as a continent of possibilities. Some of you may be familiar in the last 20 or so years of the changing narratives that have been played out in global media, including some of the discussions that have been held on very important global platforms, such as The Economist, that in one moment can shape the continent as a problem continent, and in another as a possible or a hopeful continent. Further, we find that the continent has been presented as a continent of disunity. We still struggle with the idea of Africa as a united continent, despite the fact that from the Cape to Cairo, we see one continuous and contiguous spread of people of Africa. Oftentimes, when you read in scholarship writing, popular writing, Africa is divided as the Saharan countries and then sub-Sahara. Some of us would rather see the continent as a united continent with diverse people, cultures, and ecosystems. The Sahara is not a divide, but in fact, when you look at Africa through time, was a space that was inhabited, and was actually a place of great production of not only culture, but also food production. Therefore, it's important to recast the continent in terms of why is it presented as a developed continent. And this in part has to do with narrative beyond the 19th century, where the continent, when it became divided post the Berlin Conference, was divided among imperial rulers, including countries today in the European Union and beyond, such as the UK, who would have ownership of large tracts of territory on the African continent, dividing them oftentimes across pre-existing kingdoms and united spaces, and creating new facades of new countries, which today, unfortunately, we are beholden to. However, since the advent of the African or Organization of African Unity, we saw that the African continent tried very hard to strive for the liberation of itself, including for those countries which were in the southern part of the continent that would gain their liberation much later. Since the formation of the AU, we've seen this discourse of trying to strive for Africa's unity being very central to shaping Africa's current and future agenda of development. Unfortunately, we are now familiar with the recurrent narrative that Africa is unable to unite, either because we are framed as unable to unite because of our diversity of ethnic and of linguistic and of cultural and religious diversities. However, it's quite clear that the continent, since time immemorial, has been home to many diverse religious, cultural, linguistic, ethnic, and racial milieu of people and mixes. So it's important to have that in mind as we frame the idea of how is it that the continent is perhaps finding unity elusive. Some of us would also argue that the idea of unity is in fact a discourse that oftentimes misses the point that across the world today, even in, for example, the global north, unity is oftentimes an elusive project that has come with costs. We've seen, for example, the balkanization of Europe, the breakup of the former Soviet republics, the continued quest for unity, even in singular countries where conflicts internal to those countries take away this narrative that they are more united than the continent can be. So it's important when we think about the idea of unity and liberation of development that we continue to frame the continent in the context of a global world where such unity may equally be elusive. Likewise, the idea of the continent as lagging behind in development oftentimes does not place into context the very fact that through time and space, the continent has been leading in the innovation of technology, of knowledge, and of science, which today oftentimes are attributed to others. And this has again been highlighted in more recent times in the context of medical breakthrough technologies, where we now see the reclamation of such knowledge, especially the attribution with hindsight to the role of Africans who were taken from the continent and were enslaved in the Americas, among others, as some of the pioneers of some of the modern medical know-how and technology, including vaccine development, and also many other areas of science and biomedical research. So in this regard, in my conclusion, I would like to see us engage in an exercise where we are re-envisioning Africa's futures and looking at the issue of Africa's development as not just repositioning it in the context of a global South, global North, but looking at the continent as a space which is capable, among other things, of re-energizing itself in how it uses its own resources, which would be human capital, natural resources, and many other areas, including, of course, knowledge. And I wanted to share with you some of these issues through some of these images of narratives of othering. Many of you are familiar, especially those of you who may have grown up in the 80s, we're familiar with two strong, powerful narratives. Africa as a continent at war with itself and with its people. So the idea of especially men being at war, always carrying weapons, always being projected as very dark Black people with weapons and looking very, very terse or hateful, is very familiar through the 80s, 90s, and even in more recent times. We see this imagery coming through very, very strongly, defining what and how we absorb knowledge about ourselves. However, we know that the continent to this date does not have places or spaces or the technologies that manufacture these weapons of mass killing. Most of these are not, you could say, produced on the continent, but they are purchased and used within and by Africans against each other, whether across borders or within national borders. We also are familiar with the issue of the positioning of the African child as a poster child for whatever narrative, whether it's world hunger or it's poverty or it's disease, and also, of course, the stark issue of death. We've seen how the continent has always been presented as a bleak continent of hopelessness, of death, and of starvation and other things. However, these narratives belie what are other narratives of young, hopeful, entrepreneurial, questing for knowledge young Africans who never make it to popular media. And these are the stereotypes that even as we see the changing in the nature of media, including the self-storytelling that happens with the advent of new media, such as social media, these are deep-seated narratives that continue to plague how we also perceive ourselves as a people across the continent. And I wanted to start with unraveling these narratives. As an archaeologist, one of our very first starting point is the origin of humankind. And this starts in very personally for me in my region, Southern Africa. In the area of the Sterkfontein Caves in South Africa, an area we call the cradle of humankind, we found many, many rich remains that give us clues and know-how today to the history of humankind, including the remains of hominids such as Homo naledi, Australopithecus africanus, and many others. Likewise, some of you may be familiar with the Ishango Bone, or what has been called the Ishango Bone. It's featured and unfortunately perhaps continues to feature elsewhere and be held elsewhere out of the continent as one of the mysteries of the continent. However, Those who are familiar with this artifact know that it's one of the earliest indicators of great mathematical and scientific technological know-how on the continent, because those who have researched and deciphered and decodified this artifact know that it's one of the very first earliest indicators of the systems of computational mathematics and other forms of science across the continent. This coming from, again, the SADC region in the Congo tells us that, notwithstanding the narratives I just shared with you earlier, there are other forms of remains of heritage and of humans that show that the continent has and continues to show evidence of the richness and diversity of technology and knowledge production. In more recent times, we are also familiar with the mineralogical wealth of the continent. The Mapungubwe rhino coming from South Africa in the Limpopo region may be familiar to some of you, maybe not. But we know that across the entire continent, whether from the ancient Egyptian, Meroitic, or Sudanic civilizations, the production of mineral wealth and other forms of wealth, including currencies that were used to exchange across the continent, from the north to the south, from the east to the west, west to east, and across the entire axis of the continent, marked how people interacted, co-produced food resources, technological resources that were exchanged through trade systems that again have been documented. But these, unfortunately, because of the nature of the archaeological practice, were not researched in their early forms by African indigenous archaeologists, but were researched and their narratives were, unfortunately, ascribed to others. So the story of Mapungubwe, for example, has always been about the story of Phoenicians, of external others who must have come to the Limpopo area of South Africa to be part of the making of these great kingdoms, whether it's the Monomotapa or Mapungubwe or any other kingdom in Southern Africa. These have had to be revised as narratives. And today we know, without any limit of knowledge, that these were produced indigenously by people of African descent, in situ, as we call it. We are also familiar with the Benin bronzes. This panel, for example, which has for the longest of time been in foreign museums, some are in the British Museum, some are in other museums in the Western world, were taken away at the turn of the 19th century from the continent, from what is modern day Nigeria and Benin Republic. And they continue to reside outside, and oftentimes were ascribed to others who may have come to influence those communities. But we do know that this art form is indigenous to these regions and the continent at large. So in other words, whether we are looking at technologies that we're looking at manufacture, mineral fabrication, or the use of any type of material, was indeed knowledge that was within and held by communities. So the question then is, where would that science have come from, if not from the indigenous peoples of those regions, whether we're looking at the rainforest regions of the Cameroon, of Nigeria, or the Sahelian region of ancient Mali, and the Songhai Empire, or in this case, the Meroitic civilizations that is in the Horn of Africa, or coming down south into the heart of the continent, the Great Lakes region, the discoveries that we now know in the Tanzanian region, where iron working and iron smelting were known to have be dating back to the before Christian era. So these are some of the issues as archaeologists when we say, how do we rewrite these narratives? We need to be familiar with. And you're just giving you this reference before I come in now to speak to these very same issues, just where I would have gotten my sources. So I'll just leave you with this slide and talk about more why we need to be looking at these issues from a very, I would say, globalized lens as African scientists. In more recent times, we've seen the impact of development challenges across the continent, especially in the last 30 years, with the advent of the challenges of climate and the environmental changes or challenges, the famines that affect the continent, the increase in desiccation across the Sahara, the Sahel, and other parts of the continent, the increased insecurity of humanity due to reduced food production, and then, of course, more importantly, the increased challenge of public health epidemics. The pre-HIV epidemics, we were battling with malaria, and then with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, we were battling with that as a complex pandemic interfacing with TB, malaria, and then of course HIV/AIDS. Likewise, we're looking at the problem of food resource limitations or shortages. The continent, unfortunately, ended up being in a situation where we're always extending a begging bowl to the global north. Whether we're doing that through the financial institutions such as World Bank or the IMF. From the 1980s, the continent had to reduce its social protection systems across the continent to ensure that it could meet its obligations in terms of international financing systems. Unfortunately, that came with increased challenges in providing for citizenry, whether it's in education, public health, or even other critical human needs, such as water, sanitation, and so forth. But I think this was most marked in the area of the reduction of food production and food security. So up until the 1990s, we saw the increasing reduction of food security across the continent. And as a result, the continent increased its spending into importation of food. Contrary to that, we saw the increased extraction of mineral resources and other forms of wealth from the continent, whether we're looking at cocoa, tea, or shea butter, or many other products that were destined for export. So the balance of trade in terms of import, export, meant that many countries across the continent were relying very heavily on imported goods, but we're also sending a lot of natural, unrefined products out of the continent, whether it's oil, whether it's food resources, or in this instance, even our forest resources. Among other things, we also saw from the late 1990s to date, the continued hemorrhaging of human capabilities in terms of what has been called the brain drain. People moving increasingly to the global north and more recently to other parts of the continent or other parts of the world to secure better livelihoods. And our countries and governments have wrestled with this issue of the brain drain. And this has oftentimes been posited as the continent's wealth in terms of human capital not being able to meet their needs on the continent. This may be well and good. However, we are aware now that with technology, many people are able to function and continue to contribute meaningfully to their own countries without necessarily being resident in those countries. And we've seen this with the explosion of new technologies, especially with Southeast Asia and countries like India, where the exportation of technology has enabled remote work in many parts and enabling people who are in the diaspora to be able to continue developing and producing knowledge. However, the African continent seems to still be struggling with that issue. And what has oftentimes been seen as the incapacity of governments to harness the technical and other know-how of its own citizenry who are abroad to be able to feed back into the knowledge production loop of the continent. We now know today, especially in the context of the post-COVID world, that this also is a narrative that needs to be unpacked and oftentimes critiqued, because we do know that many scientists and other scholars across the continent who are resident beyond the borders of the continent, in this case in the diaspora, are very willing to contribute and feed back and plow back. And there are many that we can cite to the continent in terms of technology exchange and knowledge exchange. However, this is not a very simple mechanism where one can simply plow back knowledge into a system or ecosystem of knowledge production that in fact has not primed itself to being a recipient of such technology. And we've seen this with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, where when the pandemic, I would say, battered the continent, many scientists who were willing and able to bring back their technological and other know-how were perhaps unable to quickly plug into the ecosystem, among other things, because of the infrastructure that would have been decimated during the 80s when the very strong structural adjustment programs would have weakened, for example, health systems or education systems. That notwithstanding, we've seen the increased innovation around financing mechanisms that enabled African scientists to establish partnerships on the continent across universities, research institutions to enable knowledge transfer, where young scientists are able to be mentored by senior academics in the diaspora, enable them to develop that technological capability to ensure that knowledge production can continue, including, of course, scientific knowledge production of biomedical sciences. We saw with the Ebola pandemic further that there's been a concerted effort of ensuring indigenous research development capability across the entire African continent. And with it, of course, is the critiquing of the idea that African governments are unable or unwilling to finance science and research. In the main, even for those countries that may be resource poor, many of us would have been educated through public education systems that enabled us to receive a fully subsidized education through the public education system, including up to university. The first time we encountered, you could say, global education is when we went abroad for our further education, oftentimes post-PhD. So the idea that we were not receiving support on the continent is oftentimes without a basis. If anything, what one finds is that the global north would readily harness and harvest that very fantastic human capital, the cream de la cream of the continent's education systems, when it is ready to be harnessed. But the mechanism to ensure the return or the replenishing has not always been equal or just. So as a result, you find that many scientists who are now able to be at the later end of their career to plow back to their own countries or across research programs across the continent would be hampered by other barriers that may not necessarily reflect an unwillingness of their countries to ensure a replenishing or repayment or restoration of the human capital on the continent. And I think what we've seen in more recent years, I think in the last decade, is a very concerted effort of African, I would say, pioneers, including philanthropists, to ensure that they make visible these efforts. For example, just to give an example, well, I'll just perhaps start off with this very platform where we're working from within. ASFI indicates one of those very important mechanisms and initiatives that is aiming to highlight the importance of harnessing across the global divides of scientists who are on the continent and those who are in the diaspora. Likewise, initiatives such as the Next Einstein Forum, the programs that have been financed by global philanthropic partnerships, including, for example, Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, have enabled scientists to develop those robust science programs that ensures mentorship of R&D across. We've also seen the African Union invest very strongly in not only envisioning our future as a continent, but also in setting into place very robust programs for the development and implementation of science agenda, including the STISA, which have ensured that countries and regions across the continent can begin to actively implement R&D programs, STEM programs that ensure that young and established and experienced scientists can work hand in hand and harness the resources. However, what has oftentimes been lacking and lagging behind has been the coming to the party of the global financial systems, including, of course, the private sector. And this is because the global financial systems works in different ways, which I will not go into detail here for. But we're all familiar that most of our countries do not have, you could say, the principal headquarters of most global corporations, but we have maybe third, fourth generation institutions which do not have the decision-making powers that may maybe reside elsewhere. And that is why it's important when we begin to see these initiatives of global philanthropic organizations, which are directly bringing financing to R&D on the continent, that we should stand up and take notice. And I again will highlight some of those new initiatives that are seen on the continent, including new science foundations that are being funded directly or being supported through other third-party mechanisms by global financing philanthropic organizations to ensure that R&D can be directly enabled and driven by scientists on the continent. We've seen more recently with the advent of the COVID pandemic, what the chief of the WHO has called vaccine apartheid, the very strong interest and initiatives that have been developed, leading to date, countries taking into their own hands the development of vaccines. So in the last 3 years, we've seen some countries and consortia on the continent going directly towards vaccine development on the continent for the continent because the lessons were too harsh. Those lessons of vaccine shortages on the continent at the height of the pandemic. Similarly, we've seen with the Ebola pandemic, initiatives that have taken into account the importance of indigenous knowledge, indigenous medical technologies in developing systems of biomedical interventions, including alternative medication that ensures that communities can be part and parcel of the process of knowledge production without excluding communities who may be knowledge holders in this process. So when we talk about the global ecosystem of knowledge production, of technology, manufacturing, or other kinds of products production, and including of innovation, we need to be mindful that these histories are intertwined and oftentimes are not immune to the kind of narratives that may exclude knowledge, know-how that may already be there on the continent. Now, the question now is, where do we go to from here? And this is where I have highlighted my interest in African futures and the issue of how does science and technology and the reclamation of knowledge come into play when we are looking at the future of the continent. And this is why this slide that I've kept here is important. You may be familiar in the last 2 years in particular, the discourses that have been ongoing about the restitution of African heritage material that is residing in most likely Western museums, but also elsewhere outside of the Western world. A lot of Africa's heritage resources has been taken out, oftentimes illicitly, from within the continent. So whether it is not in museums on the continent or not in cultural spaces on the continent, the fact that it's external to its ecosystem is critical, because many of these artifacts, many of these heritage resources were in fact very central to the idea of a human being's well-being, of existence, of humanness, what we call Ubuntu. And it's important that we see this process of restitution and repatriation of African heritage materials back to the continents as a critical step in the restoration and reaffirmation of the African continent's space in the global play of science, technology, and innovation. Unfortunately, because some of these are not even known to our young people, to our education systems, many young Africans grew up assuming we did not possess the know-how to fabricate the kind of technology that we see in the Mapungubwe rhino or the Benin bronzes. So a young child, male or female, who's aspiring to go into the STEM sciences is discouraged because in their mind, there's nothing to inspire them to believe that they can. So the very ecosystem of education that should create that ambition, that desire to become a top-rated scientist in the young African in a school somewhere in a remote village in Uganda or in Botswana or in Nigeria is taken away. So it is critical that when we look at what we call decolonizing Africa's futures, we begin to look at why it's important to reclaim this, what we could call mnemonic devices or visuals or imagery or actual tangible material heritage that actually visualize and indicate and symbolize our capabilities as a people across the entire continent, which has oftentimes been denied. And it is in this regard that some of us believe that in rethinking science, technology, and innovation, we need to come back to the root issue of language. Unfortunately, Science education across the continent also happens a very problematic interface where many education systems across the continent, which remain fragmented, privilege teaching through colonial or imperial languages. And as a result, a young child, a young scientist who's currently emerging in a country like Senegal or DR Congo is unable to work and communicate with a young scientist emerging in Mozambique or Angola, or a young scientist emerging, for argument's sake, in Ethiopia, because of a language divide. So it takes them perhaps the better part of their growing up career into their mid-30s or 40s to master a second or third language before they can collaborate, mainly because you've used language barrier at the very beginning of the education process to make it difficult for young Africans to begin to harness language as a resource to unlocking creativity, scientific technology development, and innovation. And I think it's critical. And oftentimes when we make this point, people point out that we are arguing for further divide in the continent. This may not be the case, because if we look at other countries that have succeeded in science, technology, and innovation, they've done so through harnessing their own languages, not through second, third, or fourth languages. In Southern Africa, for example, in South Africa, you're familiar that many young people will end up mastering more than 10 languages before they can succeed in education, oftentimes at the detriment of being very productive, because they will be hindered in the learning and uptake of math, science, because of the medium of instruction that they will be forced to take, whether it is English or it is Afrikaans. So we need to rethink the agenda of education from imposing language that create more barriers to knowledge to unlock potential. Many education systems, especially tertiary, will admit a young learner who has passed almost with straight A's everything in the sciences, will not admit them to university because they failed English or French or whatever the other language may be. Not because they failed in demonstrating their capability in scientific knowledge production or capability in this instance, but mainly because they failed in a language that the assumption is that is the only language that through which they can master scientific know-how. So it is critical when we think Africa's heritage and development to begin to unlearn this idea that the future of Africa needs to be locked into privileging languages that were hitherto our imperial colonial languages. Further, we need to rethink the issue then of Africa's unity. Oftentimes when we think Africa's unity, we think about breaking down borders and trying very hard to ensure we become one happy country. That is not the idea of unity. The idea of African unity is beginning to find smart ways in which we can harness inter-country, inter-regional, intercontinental human capital development. And this is the kind of models that are being used by many global financing or philanthropic scientific financing consortia. If you look at, for example, science financing agencies like the Wellcome Trust, this would ensure, for example, through the African Academy of Sciences, that researchers work together in teams, partnership across country, across programs in a multi-transdisciplinary way that goes beyond the national borders of institutions, of countries, but also ensuring that you also take those young scientists and partner them with already established scientists. So deliberately making sure that funding or financing of science breaks down these privileges that have been hitherto established, makes sure that those that are emerging that way beforehand unable to gain access to financing, to research, R&D resources, are able to come into partnerships with established scientists. Otherwise, those who have been ahead of the race will continue being ahead of the race. This we've seen working with funding programs such as the Delta's Africa program that was financed under the African Academy of Sciences. And these are some of the templates that we need to begin to replicate in ensuring that we can unite Africa's scientific partnerships to ensure that we break down these silos that are between disciplines, within language, cultural sectors, but also within geographic boundaries. And I think finally, in my view, the idea that the post-COVID continent needs to stand strong and affirmed in its own capability to entrepreneur or to create entrepreneurships that enable young Africans, whether through formal education systems or informal education systems, to gain access to resources is critical. We've seen with COVID that where the world literally shut the continent out, the continent did not stop thriving. Young Africans were able to develop those technologies, even scale them up to global commercialization for whether it was freshwater production or sanitizer production, or even ensuring those innovations that ensure that people were safe and harnessing indigenous medication. These have been utilized. The question then is, why is it that the continent is not perhaps accelerating these initiatives to ensure that especially the youth are able to harness and continue benefiting from the rich resources of the continent? That is the moot question, and that is something that I think needs to be addressed. And this is where the issue of now justice and inclusive development come in. Oftentimes across the continent, we see that those who possess knowledge and ideas oftentimes don't have capital. And their ideas oftentimes are taken by those who will have capital, repackaged and appropriated. So it is in this regard that it's critical that we begin to review and critique very strongly the systems that we have today of IP. As academics, we are familiar that we are in a global world that is publish or perish. We run after the most high-rated scientific journals or A-listed scientific journals at the expense of those that are emerging on the continent. It would be interesting to begin to see what would happen if we change the agenda and paradigm to say we are going to begin to privilege those resources for knowledge production and knowledge visibilization on the continent. Some universities now or some institutions are beginning to say we will first and foremost recognize our young emerging scholars when they publish first locally. But the agenda of science and society, unfortunately, still remains a bit obscure or a bit unappreciated. And it's critical as scientists that we begin to really look and critique the idea of how as scientists, especially scientists who are on the continent of African descent, including the diaspora, are actually making sure that our science is accessible to our own communities, who in fact, in the main, are co-producers of such knowledge. Oftentimes we write for ourselves and consume knowledge within our own communities. It's critical that as a part of an ethical scientific culture, we begin to ensure that we can produce knowledge with communities, for communities. And that is the democratization of science, technology, and innovation that we need. In respect to capitalization, it is critical that as scientists, we also begin to look beyond, you could say, our very small world of microscopic or archaeological spaces, and begin to look at how we can become smarter at understanding how global finance works, so that we can become much more meaningfully impactful in raising resources for ensuring community-based science can thrive and can be harnessed, and especially to ensure it is not taken away from communities or producers and packaged elsewhere and resold back to us. And we know across the continent many products that have fallen to that fate. And I think the COVID pandemic, and now with new emerging pandemics, we should be more acutely aware of the critical importance of ensuring that we work with and within and via communities in our own ecosystems without exporting knowledge and appropriating that knowledge as ours, but also in a fair and just manner, democratizing the space of science. I thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for this eminent presentation.
Thank you very much, Prof. I am so excited to listen to you this afternoon, this evening. To just give a recap of what Professor Segobye just discussed with us, it's been a fruitful evening for me. To say that in Africa, she has just given us a summary that we need to bring back the rich past that Africa had always had. She spoke about also relating it to the ecosystem and the knowledge of what we have always had in Africa, the pre-existing things that have we've had as background in Africa in many years, in the past 500 years, how the African continent has been plundered in terms of our natural resources, including things like forestry and our plants, that there is a need to actually reclaim all of these things, particularly because the African continent is actually lagging behind in development. And we need to also change what appears like a divided continent that we have in Africa. We know that the African unity has been put in place to bring some sort of liberation to all of these things that have affected us. But we know that we have diversity in terms of ethnics, religion, linguistics, and that there is a need to actually liberate our unity in Africa. We need to change the narrative of Africa. We need to discover, to find our unity, which seems to be eluding us. There is a need to reframe Africans' unity within the milieu of the global context. Our role in biomedical research, she spoke a lot about this, because we could actually be outstanding example of changes even in the biomedical research world, particularly because of some of the things we've been able to do as African when we had epidemics. Our role in re-energizing the human capital in Africa, and of course the natural resources. There is a need to change the history of Africa from what people knew about us, weaponizing hateful looks of African. We need to change what people believe about hungry African, issues of malnutrition and death among Africa. We need to change what looks like hopelessness in Africa. We have so many things that are yet beautiful about the history of Africa. Some of it she referred to, some of the artifacts that even been taken out of Africa to beautify other museums in the Western world. She was also able to tell us about the Makugugu Oriano in Limpopo. These are part of the African history that have been so much untold, especially the mineral wealth of Africa. And then other kingdoms in Southern Africa, and some of the things that have actually been produced in situ in Africa. Some of these challenges that we have that has affected us in the past include insecurity, issues of epidemics from HIV to malaria, natural disaster, issues of food insecurity, food shortages and limitation, and of course, our inability to meet up with our financial resources. And Africans have been seen like carrying begging bowls to donor agencies in the Western world. And sometimes some of our natural things are taken abroad, for example, cocoa, and then they give us the byproduct. There seems to be an imbalance between the issues of import and exportation in Africa. And of course, the issue of brain drain from Africa, because a lot of people believe that we don't have the adequate things to sustain their livelihood. For example, other continents, what happened in India, we could reciprocate it in Africa, where people left India to the developed world, and then they came back to give back to their community. This she termed feedback technology. It's important for us to know that we seem to have a weakened health system in Africa. We may need to have issues partnership and encourage knowledge transfer so that we can then have indigenous research development within African continent. She made example of what issues of vaccine development that is ongoing in South Africa, and that there is a need to plow back Especially, we could reverse the story of human capital harvesting. We could replenish back and feed back even to our country. One of such examples is what ASFI is doing in developing African scientists and encouraging the issues of mentorship. There are so many things we need to do. We may need to involve private cooperation, ensure sustainability, and ensure that we develop things that are indigenous to us. We could use indigenous technologies to improve our healthcare system, for example. We could also involve our young Africans so that they can come in and help to also be involved in the change of the narrative of the plunging problems in the African continent. It's important for us to ensure that we also improve science education through the use of a unified language so that we don't necessarily have to impose languages beyond the reach of many Africans for assessing their capability. She also spoke about intercontinental human capital development and the need to deliberately fund sciences, collaborations between older and younger scientists, and of course, improve capability of entrepreneurship at every level, both at formal and informal setting, so that even people who are not so educated, they can still be assisted to perform and do things appropriately. I want to appreciate Professor Segobye at this time and also to welcome questions from the audience. So many questions where I know some people are raising their hands, but we would like to first take the questions that we have. The first question says, I cannot fathom how Europeans traveled several thousands of miles to Africa and conquered, subjugated, and enslaved million Africans. Were Africans weaklings? That's the first question, Prof.
Thank you very much. As a social scientist, the issue of you could say the negative impact of the colonial experience, including, of course, the brutal impact of the transatlantic slave trade on the African person is well documented. And I think it'll take us many decades of scholarship to unravel this. I'm very happy to point colleagues to initiatives that are being done on the continent to begin to bring to the fore some of these challenges. One such initiative is a new museum that is being developed in Ghana. It's a Pan-African museum. It's called the Pan-African Heritage Museum. There's a digital version to it that I'll advise people to start exploring. That brings together Pan-African scholars in the diaspora and on the continent. Among many things it does is to bring in a wealth of resources that highlight the impact of the slave trade and other forms of human trafficking, if you could call that are pre-modern to today, that have impact on the African person, whether on the continent or in the diaspora. So the issue of the perception or self-perception of the African person is one that has been critically, I would say, studied, including, for example, scholars like Frantz Fanon, who've highlighted that it was, of course, intentional by, you could say, Europe. And I saw another question that speaks to this issue of poverty across the continent. It was intentional. Europe was a continent on the verge of death and discovered that it could utilize, you could say, inhumanity to re-enrich itself. That is a story of colonialism, imperialism, and of course, the slave trade. You could loot other people, including human beings, to re-enrich yourself. Perhaps the African continent needs to still begin to unpack that whole impact of that on the psyche of the African child, the African scholar, the African person in the restoration of our common humanity as Africans. However, many would say that we've gone beyond that. Many would say Africans have forgiven, perhaps not forgotten such ills, and we are now striving towards rebuilding a richer continent, mindful of our very traumatic pasts. And that is why when we gather like this, we're able to speak as scholars and affirmed in our identity. We're not held back by this traumatic aspect of our past, but we're trying to rewrite these narratives to harness our positive pasts to ensure that we can reclaim our humanity that was brutally taken away during the imperial colonial period. So when you speak to the, I'll speak to one of the other questions that came in the chat of poverty. Yes, Africa may seem to be poor, depending which lens you are looking from. When you look at the fact that countries such as, for example, Haiti, where people of African descent live, or on the continent of Africa today, many countries are still paying back debt that was imposed by colonial imperial nations on the continent, then it is no wonder that the continent may seem to be poor. But the continent is not poor. If we look at future scientific possibilities, including harnessing green technologies, the continent is rich, among other things, in issues such as capability to develop solar green energies. We still have the capacity to harness our oceans that surround the entire African continent with products or with opportunities that can ensure that we can harness and harvest clean energies. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, the capital resources that we need to do that with are elsewhere. Some countries like Botswana, for example, place wealth elsewhere outside the continent in the hope that the future we can harness those resources. Unfortunately, with the downturn of global economic systems like the meltdown in 2008, those countries that put their resources elsewhere lost their monies. It is not that Africa is a poor continent. Africa is a rich continent. As we speak, as we always say, the United Kingdom does not produce coffee or tea or shea butter, but that is where you find those products processed and resold back to the continent. It's a changing of the paradigm of development that enables us as the continent to see the importance of not exporting raw materials, but ensuring that the processing of resources can be done on the continent, and the finalized products are the ones that can then be sent out. If we change those paradigms, the whole outlook of poverty will change. Africa has never been a poor continent in many regards, but we take a poverty mindset that perhaps limits our capability to harness our wealth creation potentialities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. We have other questions?
Yeah, just a second. Do you see it?
No, it's coming up right. It's coming up right.
All right, so it's slow, you're saying. So let me read from here. How can African scholars make more impact in their knowledge production and become more visible in scientific research compared to the global North knowledge production?
Thank you very much for that question. Some of you who may have been scholars and students in the, well, say from the 70s throughout the 1990s, it was almost a given that when you went abroad from the continent to do your master and PhD, you left your knowledge out in whichever university you were studying. For example, I would have studied in Cambridge, and it's common fact that most of us would have left what we came with as our own knowledge with those institutions. And many of our professors would have gone on to publish using examples, you know, ideas that we may have contributed to, and we became footnote references in their production. Unfortunately, at that time, the world of scholarship did not hold people accountable to meaningfully co-producing knowledge. Thankfully, in the last, say, 20 plus years, since 2000, you could argue, science has become more introspective and more self-critical. And the world of scientific knowledge production now insists that all scientists who produce knowledge with their mentees, proteges, must co-produce. In fact, more recently, I think it's Nature, some journals are refusing to accept single or two-person authored articles that do not acknowledge the co-producers of knowledge. So unfortunately, the injustice that would have been meted on producers of knowledge who were from other places, including students who went abroad or even in our own campuses on the continent, meant that we silenced and excluded co-producers of knowledge. So it's not that there was a deficit of knowledge capability on the continent. It's because they were unfortunately excluded. But more just science society requires that we become much more ethical in our process of scientific knowledge production, including access to journals. You know that today there's an increased emphasis open science, open source, and production of knowledge that is on the commons, which wasn't the case when we were emerging as scholars. So you find that young scientists perhaps have a better chance of being visibilized in science than they might have been 20 years ago. Also, that new technologies that enable young scholars to self-publish means that they have better access than perhaps we may have had 30 or so years ago. So I think we are beginning to see what I call the re-democratization of the space of knowledge production and also dissemination of knowledge in ways that were hitherto not possible. So we're beginning to see more emerging. We could say there's an explosion of knowledge and technology, including, of course, the tangible production of scientific products, which beforehand were taken away from young ideational thinkers because they didn't know how to package it. But now with a small camera from your cell phone, a young person can begin to document the process that they are producing something and are able to put it out there to the public and then get inputs. So no one can knowledgeably steal ideas as what was possible beforehand in the world of science production. So I think we're seeing this new opportunity, which is where my emphasis about the possibilities of making new futures for the African continent real, because it is increasingly becoming difficult for those who could appropriate knowledge that is not theirs and package it as theirs to continue doing so. And we welcome that development. Thank you.
The next question says, how can Africa, some people believe that if all Africans are moved to Europe and all Europeans to Africa in 50 years, the reality today will be in the reverse. Is something wrong with the black skin of the DNA?
Thank you for that question. As an archaeologist, most of us know that the issue of race is just skin deep. We are all one common humanity. And those of you who perhaps are following the research work of genomic studies and many esteemed scientists on the continent know that a lot has actually happened that has taught us a lot about the African persons or people of African descent, including the breakthrough in medical technologies and the finding solutions for medicine, including vaccines, based on our knowledge of genomics today. So I think it has to do with mindsets. And that is why I was saying that social scientists like Fanon, who writes about this issue of black skins, white masks, highlight this issue that until people are able to go beyond the self, you could say the self, you could say, what is the word I want to use? The self-hate that comes with being black, and the reaffirmation, as Steve Biko would say, of being comfortable in one's own skin, will always look to this warped sense of racialization as how we define ourselves. In my view as a scientist, the idea of race is just skin deep. Unfortunately, those who were able to utilize that knowledge and use it to oppress others have benefited. But it is important that today, when we are educating about identity, we are able to highlight that this issue is just a fallacy. There's nothing rooted in difference or intellectual know-how that is based on race. It was just the idea of 19th century racialized science that made us, or made people believe that people who are blacker from the continent are less able we are all one humanity. That's why I was highlighting that when you look at the science of it, paleontology, we are all Africans when all is said and done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I like that question. And then the fourth question says, why does progress on achieving of the Millennium Development Goal remain so low in the continent, so uneven? Why do the absolute and relative number of people living in poverty remain so high? Why do so many people face drought and malnutrition, joblessness, and minimal access to basic services, such as energy, clean water, healthcare, and education? Why are so many women marginalized and disenfranchised? And why is inequality increasing? Finally, who is to blame for the poverty in Africa?
Thank you very much for this composite question. In fact, I part answered the final part because I read it in the chat. As I said, Africa as a continent is not poor. And then going to the subset of the question further up. I'd like to draw attention to something, again, from the social sciences. And this is the fallacy that the African continent has a deficit in terms of ability to provide for its people. Unfortunately, when you look at, especially the Western world, some of us who were lucky enough to reside, for example, in the UK, we came to understand that the idea of poverty or food limitation is not having plenty to eat, but it's understanding the meaning of food and having a relationship with food. In the Western world, for example, you could have a whole array of things that you can eat, but remain chronically unwell. The rise in non-communicable diseases in the global north, if you take, for example, the USA, obesity, is an indicator that having plenty to eat does not equal having wellness and well-being and health. In fact, many Africans are much more resilient in terms of well-being. Until more recent times, in the last 30 years, for example, NCDs have increased on the continent, which was not the case, because we've left systems of food production and food technologies that enabled Africans to have well-being, sadly. So we have problems of, for example, childhood obesity, including chronic ailments that can lead to, for example, diabetes and other illnesses, which were not there. And I think this is because the idea of what it means to eat and live well has changed so much. So you find that the increased malnutrition, if you look at African urban settings, where we emphasize non-nutritional foods, such as maize pap or maize meal, white rice, and an increase in use of refined foods, sugar, oil, at the expense of indigenous foods that were rich in fiber, has increased. That is why today, if anyone is following the story of Coca-Cola, South Africa introduced a tax on sugar. Coke was very smart to very quickly introduce Coke Zero. So when you go to KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, to buy your KFC takeaway meal, they will offer you the regular Coke with an added R1 or R2, and the Coke Zero is less in price because the government did take the liberated policy to tax sugar. So you begin to see the way in which private companies are able to respond to interest in the market, to those things that would, for example, have been drivers of perhaps lack of well-being and health. But that being said, it is important that when we look at systems of food production and realizing health across the ecosystem of food production on the continent, we look at some of these drivers of lack. The continent, unfortunately, remains one of those regions where intra-continental trade in food resources is very poor. The infrastructure for ensuring food transfers or food resource trade, even within the region like Southern Africa, remains poor, despite proximity of countries to each other. So, for example, Tanzania may be producing huge quantities of food resources that we need, like, for example, fruits, which we need in much drier areas like Southern Africa, but we don't have access to them because we're export-oriented. So these are some of the things when we begin to look at new instruments that like the Africa Free Trade instruments that have been introduced, we see a deliberate policy shift of the continent to encourage retaining food wealth and resource on the continent instead of being outward looking. And this is where the issue of malnutrition or lack comes into play. It's a policy issue that says deliberately will reduce price costs and encourage growth of local products that will nurture and ensure that Africa can have much more sustainable food resources. That's very critical in terms of paradigm shift of policy and then, of course, action on the continent. Thank you. I hope I've answered that question well. Okay, just to answer this question, the issue of academic freedom, again, there's always a fallacy that on the continent of Africa, there's less academic freedom. I tend not to believe this to be the case. I mean, if you look at what has happened with the COVID pandemic, it became very clear that big pharma in the global north, if we take, for example, the companies that took the lead in developing the COVID vaccine, they did not immediately make that available to every citizen across the world. In fact, that knowledge is still being held back. So when they talk about academic freedom and access to knowledge, it's not something that is only plaguing scientists on the continent. Scientists in the global north or other continents, in fact, are also challenged by the same issue. In my view, it is now critical that the world of science, through a global association and the World Science Forum, begin to bring this issue of science policy making and science diplomacy much more to the forefront, because it's not even about scientists in one country versus their governments. It's most times scientists working together, facing the challenge of big capital, global capital, or capitalist systems that would want to constrain them from sharing for free their knowledge, constrain us from having that academic freedom. Many scientists would happily have shared their know-how when it came to COVID treatments, but they couldn't because they were bound by the IP or gagging orders of their institutions. And this is something that the world of scientists began to make much more visible during the COVID pandemic. So it's actually about ethical science and the ability to unite and form a solidarity as scientists that will give us a little bit more voice and leverage to fight back against big pharma. And it really began to truly come through when we're looking at the COVID pandemic. And those are lessons we need to leverage into the next set of pandemics that may challenge us. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. The next one says, the language barrier has been engraved in stone in Africa. In Nigeria, for instance, a great number of students are unable to get a university education because they did not pass the English exams. I will suggest a pass in any other language should be acceptable, just in the same vein as a pass in English language. Can this win? Can the institution accommodate the number of students that would have been liberated from this English limitation?
Yes, this is a tragedy that we see. As I said, as has been said earlier in my introduction, happened to be based in Namibia. And here one witnessed a situation where the country transitioned from the colonial language of German to Afrikaans and then to English. And we see many young aspiring scientists or scholars, learners, not being able to gain access to tertiary education because of the failure to pass English. It is tragic, and it is self-harm that we do unto ourselves as a continent. Unfortunately, language policies are very complex things in countries, and there's no one panacea that can solve the issue. I think increasingly though, even today in the science funding landscape, we begin to see funding bodies begin to force us as perhaps reviewers of science to be more accommodating of diversity of language, so that a scientist who is, for example, presenting a proposal for financing is not being disadvantaged just because they speak Amharic or any other language other than English, or because they speak French and not English, that they are being excluded. So these are welcome developments in the world of science funding. Now, when we go to education, I personally will argue that as a continent, we've also overprivileged university education. One of the things I learned and appreciated in Namibia, for example, is the potential of TVET education, technical vocational education, as a route towards sustainable education. That is not being harnessed. I know countries like Ghana and Kenya are also begin to increasingly develop that TVET education system, which ensures that even if a young person does not succeed in passing English and going the route of the university entrance exams, they can, if they are, for example, gifted in the technical skills, follow and pursue an equally productive livelihood in the technical education system. That is not making TVET the poor cousin of university education, but in fact privileged to be on par. And that is again a paradigm and policy shift that we have not yet really begun to do on the continent. But I'm happy to say that at the AU level and at the RECs, increasingly there are TVET policies that are seeking to ensure that at country and local levels, implementation of TVET education policies can begin to unshackle this overdependency on a colonial language as the only means towards a livelihood that is sustainable. And I think that's a welcome move, but it's also for our government to change our language policies. And this actually hasn't really happened at the pace we would really wish to see it happening on the continent, which is a pity.
Thank you very much, Prof. The African continent is very unstable because of internal and border wars. How can this permanent conflictual situation promote the development and progress of archaeology?
Thank you for the question. I mean, as I said earlier, it's interesting if you are in, which is an area that I'm also doing research in, if you're in the area of peace and conflict studies, you'd actually know that most of the conflicts that have been on the continent in the last, say, for argument's sake, 80 years, have not necessarily been originated on the continent. Some of them are proxy wars. If you take the war in Libya, these are proxy wars that were very seriously rooted in resources, natural resources. And unfortunately, people become collateral damage. If you look at the Sahel today, some of the conflicts that we see with extreme terror groups are not necessarily conflicts that are financed from within the continent, they're financed from without the continent. So I think it's important to take a multidimensional view of the study of conflict and the lack of security on the continent, because oftentimes the assumption is that these are conflicts that are ethnic or born from within African communities. In fact, you will find when you work, especially with border communities, that many communities actually coexist very well across border, national border, or what you call colonial borders, but in fact, do not have the capacity to realize those systems of coexistence and even co-development, because oftentimes we have to respect international boundaries, we have to respect international treaties. It is critical also to look at the issue of the militarization of the continent. The proliferation of small arms across the continent, again, are not oftentimes from within the continent. These are manufactured elsewhere. These find their ways into the continent. These are bought by our governments. We need to begin to hold our governments accountable as civil society and as scientists to the issue of why it is we privilege militarization over developing of education, public health, and other social development projects across the continent. We haven't done this as scientists. In fact, if anything, we may inadvertently promote the development of weapons or weapons of mass destruction without knowing that the end result will be the obliteration of our own people. And this is where, again, ethical science becomes to be a very critical lens through which every emerging scientist must see their scientific practice. Is my science going to contribute to a positive good in my community, across the continent, across the world? If not, how do I reverse that? So this is where the issue of climate justice and climate-related sciences are an increasingly important area where young African scientists must be investing their education, their know-how. because this is an area where we are perhaps poorly represented as a people. We are not present at the table of discussions, and the recent Glasgow meetings were a case in point. When the major decisions were being made, including for small island nations in the Caribbean, we as Africans perhaps did not have the same voice as science-informed decision makers, because genuinely we have not financed R&D to the level where we can become impactful in our advocacy in this regard. So I think it's about, again, solidarity in science as African scientists on the continent in the diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you very much, extraordinary Professor of Archaeology, Professor Alinah Segobye. It's been a fruitful evening for us all. I would like to say that we still have some few more minutes to the end of this program. Kindly raise your hand if you would like to ask the professor any questions directly, so that we can give you an opportunity to do so. The floor is open for us to ask questions directly from Professor Segobye. Prof, it's indeed been a wonderful time for me. I've learned so much about Africa. I just don't want to be an African without knowing the background of where I am in and I am from. Thank you so much. We really appreciated you for this wonderful and fruitful deliberation that we have this evening. And I must say that we enjoyed your answers to all of the questions because they were quite robust. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the questions and I appreciate the platform. Thank you.
Okay. If we don't have any other questions, do you have any information for us, Bright?
Yes, thank you very much, Olabisi, for the sterling moderation of this session, and to Professor Alinah. As usual, this has been very provocative. It shows where we are. It shows that Africans, we have quite a lot to do.
Can I very quickly answer a question that came, which is very critical?
I just saw that question and I was just going to read it out to you.
Yes, Prof.
The question says, how do you get mentors to help young researchers?
And that's exactly my passion now. As I said earlier, there are organizations across the continent that are actually doing that. One is the first starting point is national science foundations that are there in most countries across the continent. Then there are other regional entities like the African Academy of Sciences. There are new and established foundations like the Next Einstein Forum or Foundation. There's also the Science for Africa Foundation. There are many that are emerging, including ASFI right here, that are creating the opportunity for established scientists to meet emerging scientists, to create mentorships. And again, I'll say for young scientists here, if you begin to attend some of the events that the colleagues co-conveners have been organizing, you begin to find opportunities for networking. But I want to highlight those programs that in fact provide financing for young Africans. For example, recently, the African Academy of Sciences received financing for a new program initiative that is called ARISE, that is funded by the European Commission. Or the European Union, I can't remember which one. But these are opportunities that oftentimes are then the public domain, which we can draw on and get funding to collaborate with other emerging scientists across the continent. The African Development Bank oftentimes runs small funding, seed funding programs that enable young scientists to get together and collaborate. But I'd encourage most young scientists to seek out opportunities like the one that ASFI is providing, to find new mentors outside your own field. Because once you become networks like this, you create your own community of practice, your own community of mentors, which enables you to meet people outside your own field who will be willing and happy to mentor you for free. And this is how we then, as established scientists, can begin to plow back our own knowledge, which, as I said earlier, we would have gained through public funding to study way back, to make sure that you as emerging scientists can use these opportunities. And I think I just wanted to highlight that. But look at, for example, these established foundations and funding bodies on the continent and beyond, where there's been pools of mentors who are willing to assist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. There is a final question, Bright. This is also very important. It says, with all the realities pointed out and discussed in this presentation, What are we as Africans to do and not to be accused of Afrocentrism in a global world of today? That's the last we are taking tonight.
You know, I always believe I'm a very strong Pan-African, and I'd even go further and say I'm an Afrocentric person. By being Afrocentric, it doesn't mean that you're negating everybody else to establish their identity. No, it doesn't. Like Steve Biko said, by affirming your Blackness doesn't mean you deny somebody else from being affirming their own identity, racial or otherwise. By being a feminist doesn't mean you are denying somebody else the chance to establish their own identity, but you are affirming yourself, your own personhood, to begin to harness and leverage your gifts and capabilities to ensure you optimize your, I would say, God-given know-how and technology to be able to plow back to the best of your ability. Otherwise, we become self-limiting. If you look at the work of people like Professor Molefi Asante in the US, who is a very strong, we say, founder of Afrocentrism, by virtue of him affirming the importance of ancient Egypt in the foundation of African scholarship and attributing African science in the part of Africa that is now Egypt, Meroe, and so forth. It's not to take away that others have their own knowledge systems, but it's to actually bring home the fact that those knowledge systems were first and foremost created and founded in Africa, and should not be left to chance to assume that they were founded elsewhere. It's always amazing how many people assume that the Greco-Roman world is where knowledge fountainship started. But in fact, it was on the African continent. And it's just the issue of appropriation of knowledge that we see, which is crippling self-affirmed knowledge of Africans in all fields of disciplines. And it's critical that we don't juxtapose Afrocentrism as the enemy of, but see it as a first and foremost self-affirmation of people of African descent, through which they are able to mediate their world and then be able to develop themselves in a much more positive light. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I appreciate ASFI for this opportunity. Bright, you can just round up for us. The time is fast spent.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Olabisi. It has been a very warm evening, and as I said earlier, quite provocative. We have a lot to do, and African scientists, you can see you have no hiding place. As Prof recognized, the world is now open and all eyes coming on us. How to get African out of this quagmire we are. I think step by step, let's continue to play our role. There are opportunities for mentorship, there are opportunities for collaboration, there are opportunities for networking. Let's look out for these opportunities and be active. We can't sit at a place and they come to us. We have to hunt for them. So we really appreciate, Prof, this opportunity. And I think several issues have been raised, and we'll continue to bring you on board so that you can continue to share this insight with us, young Africans coming up in their scientific career. So we appreciate your presence this evening. Our next seminar series will be on the 31st of July, but we are not taking, we are not bringing speakers to speak as we had today. ASFI is 2 years in July. And so we will be having this second year anniversary to look at how we have come through, and of course to celebrate with all of you. So we have themed it Beyond Little Beginnings, Counting Our First 1,000 Steps. Last year when we had our first year anniversary, it was titled Little Beginnings. Now we have taken the first steps and counting the thousands. So please, more information will be coming. Don't fail to join us and to celebrate with us. We would like to have insight, contributions, suggestions of what we can do, your needs, and let's put our hands together to drive this initiative in the right direction. So 31st of July, we'll be having this, we'll be sending information as usual to you. The 6th edition of the research tips and tricks will be coming on the, that should be 22nd of July, not June, 22nd of July. We'll correct that and send you information. What to do when an editor says no to your paper. What do you do? This is a big dilemma for young people, but it's part of the experience. So what do you do? There are things you can do. So on the next edition of Tips and Tricks, please join us as we discuss this. I have mentioned this from the beginning of this presentation, the systematic reviews and meta-analysis course coming on the 25th, 29th of July. So the application is still ongoing and closes on the 1st of July. Please do apply if you have not applied, and share the information with your colleagues so that they can apply. Finally, we have elected the officers for ASFI ambassadors. We have shared information with you. So we say congratulations to those who have dedicated their time, to serve in this office. Our goal is to synthesize this initiative across the continent to bring young Africans, scientists, old ones into this initiative so that we can all work together. So soon, I think these officers will be contacting every one of you, and so that we see how you can join the force to promote the vision we have in the ASFI community. So thank you this evening to everyone for coming, and I hope that you can join us in our subsequent programs. Eman, do you want to take pictures? Or so please, it's time you can show your face. Eman usually would like to take pictures. Eman, are you doing that?
Yes.
All right.
Please open your camera and smile.
Eman, you have to get fast camera.
Yes. Oh, this is because of snapping tool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Okay.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Olabisi. We
Thank you,
appreciate
Prof.
you.
Alinah.
Thank you very much,
Thank you, Prof.
Eman and Bright. Appreciate it.
Sure.
And thank you to all the participants. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good
Yes.
evening.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.